The roar of the mountain coming down was louder than any fire I had ever fought. The mud and splintered pine trees smashed through the cabin walls like wet cardboard. The freezing floodwater was rising instantly, swirling around my waist in the pitch-black darkness. My flashlight was gone. My leg was pinned tight under a massive, shattered roof beam. I was an old firefighter who had finally run out of luck, waiting for the dark water to rise above my chin. And then I felt the wet, frantic scraping against my chest. Barnaby, the dog who couldn't see the sun, was navigating the utter darkness of the collapsed ruins, his paws digging desperately into the jagged wood, refusing to let the water take me. He was blind, but in that black abyss, he was the only one who knew the way out.
Before the dog, my world was just smoke and ghosts. 20 years carrying people out of burning buildings until the day the roof collapsed and I couldn't carry my own crew out. The guilt didn't just break me, it hollowed me out entirely. I retreated to a damp, rotting cabin deep in the Pacific Northwest, where it rains 200 days a year. The isolation was a punishment I felt I deserved. I stopped talking. I stopped looking in the mirror because the burn scars on my neck reminded me of the men who didn't make it. Every day was a gray, suffocating routine of chopping wood, drinking cheap whiskey, and waiting for the years to finally grind me into dust. I was a dead man who simply hadn't stopped breathing yet.
It was a Tuesday, a vicious, freezing downpour that turned the mountain roads to soup. I was driving my old truck back from town when I saw it, tied to a rusted guardrail on the edge of a sheer drop-off. Someone had dumped him there to die. I pulled over, the rain hammering my shoulders. When I approached, he didn't cower, but he didn't look at me either. He stared blankly at a spot 2 feet to my left. His beautiful golden coat was a ruined, matted mess of mud and burrs, his ribs showing through the skin. And then I saw his eyes, opaque, white as milk. He was completely blind. Whoever left him didn't just abandon a dog. They threw away a life that couldn't even see the danger it was in.
I didn't want a dog. I couldn't even take care of myself, but I knew what it felt like to be left behind in the dark. I pulled a pocket knife and sliced the thick nylon rope. He didn't bite. He just stood there, trembling violently, letting out a low, pathetic whine. I scooped him up. He weighed nothing, just wet bones and fear. I placed him on a passenger seat of my truck, turned the heater on full blast, and wrapped him in a greasy wool blanket. As the engine rumbled, he slowly lowered his head onto my thigh. He couldn't see my scarred face, my empty eyes, or the ruined man I was. He only felt the warmth. For the first time in 5 years, I had a passenger. The nightmares always came at 3 a.m. The smell of melting rubber, the screaming of the alarms, the unbearable heat. I woke up thrashing, gasping for air, clutching my chest as the phantom flames licked at my memories. The cabin was freezing, but I was soaked in sweat. I was waiting for the familiar, crushing loneliness to settle back in, but instead, I felt a heavy, warm weight on my chest. Barnaby had navigated the unfamiliar room in the pitch black. He climbed onto the cot and laid his large head directly over my racing heart. He let out a deep, rumbling sigh. He didn't know about the fire, but he knew the sound of a terrified soul. In his darkness, he found mine.
Living with a blind dog requires patience. a virtue I thought I'd burned up years ago. But watching Barnaby map the cabin was a masterclass in resilience. I used different textured rugs to mark the doorways. I tapped my boots twice before entering a room. He would bump into the cast iron stove once, shake his head, and never hit it again. He learned the exact dimensions of our small, quiet world through smell, sound, and the vibration of my heavy footsteps. I found myself talking out loud, narrating my actions so he wouldn't be startled. Without realizing it, the deadly, suffocating silence of my isolation was broken. I had a reason to sweep the floor, to clear the path. I had a reason to get out of bed.
Summer brought a rare, drying heat to the mountains. I spent 3 weeks building a solid, smooth wooden fence and closing a quarter acre of the yard. I made sure there were no sharp rocks, no unexpected holes. When I finally opened the door and let him out, he hesitated. Then he smelled the pine needles. He heard the wind in the trees. For the first time since I found him, Barnaby ran. Not a nervous trot, but a full, joyful, clumsy sprint in a wide circle. He tripped over a fallen branch, rolled into the grass, and immediately popped back up with a massive, goofy grin, a pine cone clamped in his jaws. I stood on the porch, and to my absolute shock, a sound escaped my throat. It was a laugh. Rough, rusty, but real. When winter approached, I had to go into town for supplies. This time, I didn't leave Barnaby in the truck. I clipped a sturdy harness onto him, and we walked into the hardware store together. The bell chimed, and the usual silence that greeted the crazy hermit didn't happen. Old Man Miller behind the counter saw the white eyes, saw the gentle way the dog leaned against my leg, and he came out from behind the register. He brought a piece of jerky. He didn't ask about the fire. He didn't pity me. He just crouched down and talked to Barnaby. Other folks stopped, smiled, and asked the dog's name. Barnaby couldn't see their faces, but he wagged his tail at their kindness. And through him, they finally saw me again.
We established a ritual. Every evening, just before dusk, we'd walk down to the edge of the river behind the property. I would sit on a massive, mossy boulder, and he would sit perfectly still between my knees, his head resting on my arm. The water rushing over the stones was our radio. I started describing the world to him. I'd tell him how the sky was turning the color of bruised plums, how the mist was rolling over the distant peaks like a slow white river. Painted the world with words for a dog who lived in darkness. But the truth was, I wasn't doing it for him. I was reminding myself that the world was still beautiful. I was learning to see again by trying to be his eyes.
The peace was an illusion. The mountain doesn't care about your healing. The rain started in November and it simply didn't stop. For 2 weeks, the ground drank until it was bloated and sick. The river behind the cabin, usually a quiet companion, turned into a roaring, muddy monster, tearing trees from their roots. Barnaby sensed it long before I understood the danger. He paced relentlessly. He refused to eat. He kept standing by the front door, whining low in his throat, his blind eyes staring nervously at the ceiling. The heavy wooden beams of the cabin began to groan and pop under the shifting foundation. We were miles away from help, cut off by washed-out roads. The earth was preparing to give way.
It happened at midnight. A deafening, catastrophic crack, and then gravity took over. The mudslide hit the back of the cabin like a freight train. The floor vanished beneath my boots. Walls shattered. Water, mud, and timber violently exploded into the room. I was thrown hard against the stone fireplace, a massive ceiling beam crashing down, pinning my left leg in the freezing, rising water. I couldn't move. The debris was piled to the ceiling, trapping me. The water was up to my chest. And then, splashing through the pitch-black chaos, came Barnaby. He wasn't running away. He navigated the jagged, collapsing maze purely by the sound of my ragged breathing. He reached me, whining fiercely, and began to desperately bite and dig at the massive wooden beam crushing my leg, refusing to abandon me to the dark.
The water crested just below my chin before the cabin settled, groaned, and stopped sliding. I managed to leverage a piece of rebar to shift the beam just enough to drag my mangled leg free. But we were entombed in a maze of crushed timber and thick, suffocating mud. My flashlight was lost. I was completely blind in the wreckage. I panicked, hyperventilating, the claustrophobia of the fire returning to choke me. But Barnaby pushed his wet, muddy nose firmly into my hand. He didn't need light. He knew the draft of fresh air. He knew the scent of the wet pine outside. I gripped his heavy leather harness. "Lead the way, buddy," I whispered. And slowly, agonizingly, the blind dog pulled the broken man through the jagged, pitch-black ruins toward the surface.
We breached the surface into the freezing, pouring rain just as the sun began to bleed through the gray clouds. We dragged ourselves onto a high, rocky outcrop above the devastation. Hours later, the thumping rhythm of a Coast Guard chopper cut through the storm. When they lowered the basket, the rescue swimmer, a young guy from my old firehouse, hit the dirt. He stopped dead in his tracks. He saw his old captain, the guy everyone thought was a lost cause, battered and bleeding, clutching a filthy, blind golden retriever. He didn't ask questions. He just strapped the harness around both of us. The men who pull people from the rubble know a hero when they see one, even if that hero has 4 paws and unseeing eyes.
The hospital room was too bright, too sterile, too loud. They pumped me full of painkillers and stitched my leg, but I wouldn't sleep. I fought the nurses until the doctor finally bent the rules. The door opened and a nurse walked in leading Barnaby. They had washed the mud from his golden coat. He sniffed the linoleum floor, confused by the chemical smells, until he heard my rough, ragged breathing. He bypassed the nurse, walked straight to the side of my bed, and carefully rested his large chin on my mattress. I buried my scarred hands in his clean fur and finally closed my eyes. The demons were gone. The fire was finally out. I slept for 2 days, and he never left my side.
I never went back to the mountain. We bought a small, sturdy house down in the valley with a flat yard and neighbors who wave. I joined the local volunteer fire department dispatcher desk. I answer the calls. I help guide the crews. I'm useful again. Barnaby is 8 now. His muzzle is turning white to match his eyes. He sleeps on a massive orthopedic bed right beneath my dispatcher radio. People always tell me how wonderful it is that I saved a special needs dog from the side of that road. I just smile and pet his head. They have it completely backwards. I just cut a rope. Barnaby is the one who did the rescuing. He walked into the darkness of my soul, and he led me back to the light.